This is why you should never, ever let an inexperienced child take control of a cockpit of a flying aircraft. Today's story is one of the most disturbing and galvanizing human disaster stories of all time. And if you are a fan of the true dark and mysterious tales, make sure to like this video and subscribe, as it really helps out a beginner YouTube channel like myself. But without further ado, let's get into today's story. In the early spring of March of 1994, in the heart of Russia, Moscow, 16-year-old Eldar Kuczynski was excitedly packing his bags. He and his little sister Yana, who was 13 at the time, along with his father, who was an airline captain, were just about to leave on their first international flight. The father, Yaroslav Kuczynski, who was 41 at the time and will be referred to as Kuczynski from this point on, was going to be the relief captain pilot for a flight that will be traveling from Moscow, Russia to Hong Kong. The relief pilot is basically a backup pilot for a very long flight. In the event that the main captain would need to take a break from his duties, the relief pilot will basically relieve him of his duties and take command of the aircraft. And with his employment perks and discounts, the children and Kuczynski were able to receive a pretty hefty discount on their flight to Hong Kong. So that being said, the original plan was to tag along with his father Kuczynski on his flight, meet them at the destination Hong Kong, and enjoy a short burst of vacation. Once they were done packing their bags, Eldar and Yana hugged and kissed their mother goodbye for one last time, who will not be joining them on this particular trip. And as Eldar and Yana left the apartment, the mother reached out to them and reminded them one last time to call them as soon as they arrive. They responded by saying that they will. And with that, Eldar and Yana, filled with excitement and anticipation of their first international flight abroad, departed for the airport. Once they arrived at the airport and checked in all their luggages, Kuczynski and his children made their way down to their respective terminals. And at the boarding area, Eldar and Yana were finally able to see the plane that they will be boarding momentarily. It was a large Airbus A310 with its tail painted in navy blue and red strips. And the children were clearly mesmerized, and Kuczynski was able to tell that they were. So he was even more excited to be able to show off all the high technical equipment in the cockpit and just to show his children how cool his dad is being the pilot of this massive aircraft. And when they finally boarded the plane, Kuczynski introduced his children to the main crew members of this aircraft. The main captain, Andrei Danilov, was 40 at the time, along with First Officer Igor, who was 33, and they also met a third passenger pilot, who was a pilot but happened to be boarding as a passenger. However, for this particular flight, the passenger pilot had requested to the main captain if he could sit in the cockpit for this flight, in which the captain had agreed. Now, upon takeoff, there will be 4 members in this cockpit. First will be the main captain, Andrei Danilov, along with First Officer Igor and Kuczynski, the relief pilot, and the third passenger pilot who requested to sit in the cockpit for this particular flight. And respectively in the passenger cabin, there were Kuczynski's 2 children, Eldar and Yana, along with 63 passengers and 13 crew members. And as everyone boarded the plane and tucked themselves in for what should have been a long yet a comfortable flight, the main captain greeted the people and the passengers through the intercom. And just like that, the plane took off into the dark, calm skies of Moscow, Russia. The flight was anticipated to be 13 hours and 39 minutes, and for the first 4 hours, everything seemed to be going smooth. However, at 28 minutes past midnight, the main captain, Andrei Danilov, decides to take his first break. He gets up from the seat of the central pedestal, leaves the cockpit to get some rest, and correspondingly, Kuczynski, being the relief captain pilot, gets up from his seat from the back of the cockpit and seats himself into the central pedestal, where he will now be the commanding pilot of this aircraft. And it will also be around this time where Kuczynski decides to invite his 2 children, Yana and Eldar, to the cockpit. Now, this was a time before 9/11, meaning that the airport security rules were not as stringent as it is now, and therefore inviting personal acquaintances to the cockpit was a very common occurrence between pilots. And by this time, Elder and Yana are fuming with excitement. Not only are they on their way to their first international vacation, they're about to experience the entire flight directly from the cockpit. So Elder and Yana marches down the passenger aisle filled with excitement. And when they reach the cockpit door, they give it a knock, and First Officer Igor, hearing the knock, greets them at the cockpit door. And at which point, Elder and Yana are witness to a captivating view of the night sky. And at this point, they are completely mesmerized and fascinated by the night view and starts exploring the cockpit. And while they were having this moment, Kaczynski was able to tell that his children were having the time of his life. And to impress his children even more, Kaczynski offers Yana an irresistible offer. Kaczynski proceeds to ask his daughter Yana, who was 13 at the time, if she would like to sit in the captain's seat. Yana excitedly agrees, obviously in full trust of his father, places her carefully into the central pedestal seat, as his father turns around and places himself directly behind the central pedestal chair, where he will still technically be in charge of this aircraft. So at this point, you have Yana seated on the central pedestal, First Officer Igor on the right pedestal, Kaczynski directly behind Yana, along with his son Eldar and the third passenger pilot who requested to be seated in the cockpit. Yana, however, who is seated in the central pedestal, realizes that she's a bit too short to enjoy the night sky. She only sees the highly technical interfaces of the cockpit and are unable to see the night sky. And so Yana naturally turns back to her father and requests if he can elevate the seat up so that she could actually enjoy the view, in which the Kaczynski agrees and elevates the seat up. Now you have a completely inexperienced outsider seated in the central pedestal of a flying aircraft that is torpedoing through the sky at 30,000 altitude and 700 miles per hour. Now, First Officer Igor, who was seated directly right side of Yana, sees all of this unfolding. But since he was just pilot monitoring, meaning that the captain was actually flying the airplane, he had his seat adjusted back to the furthest position to enjoy a more comfortable position during this flight. Now, First Officer Igor was only about 5 foot 2 inches tall, meaning that he would not have been able to reach the pedals in his current position, and these minor circumstances become a crucial factor sooner than later. And so by now, Yana is seated upright into the central pedestal, enjoying the night view sky. She has her hands on the yoke without applying any pressure, but she does have her hands on the yoke to actually simulate that she was actually flying this airplane. Now, as ridiculous as this entire situation is, it still technically wasn't fatal, as the plane was still being flown by autopilot. So long as there was not a certain amount of force applied for a certain duration of time that resisted the maneuvers of the autopilot would still be intact and would still fly the airplane, meaning that this was a relatively safe stunt to pull off. And to make her daughter Yana feel like as if she was really flying this airplane, Kaczynski changes the autopilot setting from navigation mode to heading. In a navigation mode, the autopilot would basically follow a pre-programmed route. However, as soon as you change it to heading, it's more like a manual mode. Whatever you set into the parameters into the autopilot, that's the route that they would take. So it's more like a manual mode. So Kaczynski sets it to this manual mode and changes the heading bug 15 degrees to the left. And this initiates the plane to bank slightly towards left. And as Yana has her hands up onto the yoke, it really felt like as if she was maneuvering the plane. And moments later, Kaczynski moves the heading bug 15 degrees to the right, in which the bank slightly banked towards right. And when the plane more or less returns to their initial track, Kaczynski re-engages the navigation mode. For about 7 more minutes, with the autopilot still fully engaged, Yana sits at the central pedestal until she finally makes her way down so that her brother Eldar could try the same maneuver. At this point, Eldar, who was watching his sister Yana take momentary control of the airplane, left him extremely ambitious and excited so that he could try it out for himself. And as Eldar, who was 16 years old at the time, gets seated into the central pedestal. And so Eldar, who was 16 years old and a complete outsider in the realm of piloting an aircraft, gets seated in the central pedestal. And as he is getting seated into his central pedestal chair, the captain's chair, you hear the passenger pilot who was being seated in the back seat of the cockpit get up and ask him if he would like a picture taken. And of course, Eldar, being very proud of this moment, agrees and snaps out a photo. Now, Kaczynski intended on performing the same maneuver with Eldar as he did with Yana, except Eldar makes a more daring request and requests to his father if he can actually physically turn the yoke as he initiates the turn. Now, this maneuver is significantly more dangerous than the one that Yana did, as it requires a pressure to be applied to the yoke itself. In any case, being a veteran pilot with over 700 hours of flying hours under his belt, Kaczynski agrees, and the father once again switches the autopilot from navigation mode to heading. He sets the heading bug 15 degrees to the left, which initiates the left turn, and as this is happening, Eldar follows along and turns the yoke left. And when the plane has banked left enough, Kaczynski turns the turning head 15 degrees respectively to the right, just like a few moments ago. Eldar follows through by turning the yoke to the right, but at this time, Eldar applies a bit too much pressure onto the yoke. This causes the plane to bank towards right at a faster pace than intended. And to level the plane off, the automatic system kicks in and starts putting force into the left heading. Now the problem is, Eldar continues to keep his pressure onto the yoke, basically telling the airplane that he wants to continue to keep turning right. And this ultimately breaks a limit value in the autopilot. Now, the autopilot in an airplane is not just a toggle on and off switch, rather it is extremely sophisticated. There's an autopilot feature for many different types of functions of an airplane, and these functions work with conjunction with one another to successfully fly an airplane. And in most cases, there is no reason for a pilot to intervene in autopilot unless there was a particular reason to do so. Now, the autopilot is designed in a way that if you applied enough pressure to the yoke that counters the set parameters in the autopilot, it would then forfeit the control of that particular function. In this case, only the lateral channel of the autopilot was now fully disengaged. In this case, only the lateral channel of the autopilot was now disengaged. This means that the autopilot is still engaged for things like altitude and speed of the aircraft. However, now that the lateral channel is disengaged, the turning controls of the aircraft is completely free on its own. Now keep in mind that any experienced pilot would have immediately noticed the difference when the lateral channel was disengaged. If you are turning against the maneuvers of the autopilot and this decoupling happens, you would notice it immediately. However, Eldar was a complete outsider with absolutely no training on how to fly an airplane, so he didn't notice it. And First Officer Igor was slouched back on his chair enjoying the night view sky, so he didn't notice it either. And so now with the lateral autopilot completely disengaged, allowing any pressure that's applied to the yoke to freely turn the plane. And meanwhile, while Eldar is constantly applying pressure to the yoke, the plane continues to bank towards right. And as this is all unfolding, real time, nobody acknowledges or realizes that any of this is happening. And the 13-year-old daughter, Yana, unbeknownst to the magnitude of this situation, jokingly asks his father, Kaczynski, if she could go sit up in the first class. And obviously, Kaczynski, unbeknownst to him, jokingly responds that, oh, you're only going to fall asleep once you go to the first cabin, and they'll fire us all. Now, this ridiculous conversation takes up about 20 seconds. Long enough to distract Kaczynski and his crew members fail to realize that the plane has already passed the point where it should have leveled off into its original route. And unfortunately, Eldar is the first one to notice this. As he is seated directly in the central pedestal, he sees the obvious off angle from the cockpit and notifies his father and asks, "Why are we turning?" Kaczynski, kind of thrown off by this question, rephrases the question back to his son Eldar. It's turning? And by this time, the third passenger pilot who was boarded in the cockpit gets up from his seat and remarks to the other guys in the cockpit, "Guys, we are turning very, very rapidly." It takes the crew members approximately about 9 seconds for them to study the cockpit and to understand the situation. By this point, the plane has banked past a 45-degree angle to almost a 90-degree angle, which is much steeper than the design allowed. The A310 cannot turn this steeply while maintaining altitude. And so the plane now starts to descend rapidly. And as this is happening, the G-forces that are applied to the crew members inside the cabin and the cockpit makes it extremely difficult for them to regain control of the airplane. Now, as everybody is realizing this undeniable emergency, and Kaczynski, also in a slight panic, shouts out to his son Eldar to hold off the control column, to hold it. Now, it is assumed that this particular command that Kaczynski gave to his son Eldar caused him to physically hold on to the yoke itself. It will be a natural reaction for an untrained pilot. However, this was a devastating mistake. However, what Kaczynski wanted Eldar to do was to hold off the plane, to hold off the bank turn so that it maintains a level, so it doesn't steep left or right, causing it for another spin. However, what Kaczynski wanted Eldar to do was to hold off the airplane, to hold off the bank angle, and to try to level the plane off. Now, as this is happening, Eldar is physically holding onto the yoke, resisting any maneuvers that are being inputted into the yoke. First Officer Igor was attempting to maneuver the plane left as the plane was banking towards right, which would have been a correct correction. However, as Eldar firmly gripped onto the yoke, purposefully not allowing any movement, he was in real time resisting the corrective maneuvers that First Officer Igor was making that may have saved the plane. Now, the autopilot, which no longer controlled the ailerons, which are used to control the turning parts of the airplane, the autopilot, which are no longer in control of the ailerons, which are used to turn the aircraft, used its other controls to compensate. It pitched the nose up and increased thrust, which ultimately caused the plane to enter a stall. Now, unable to cope with these rapid maneuvers, the autopilot on this airplane disengages completely. And now, to make things even worse, to recover from this stall, the automatic system that is installed in this aircraft lowers the nose and basically goes on a vertical nosedive. And at this point, the G-forces drop to 0. In which case, all the passengers and the crew members inside this aircraft is experiencing weightlessness. And in the midst of these changing G-forces, Kaczynski is somehow able to regain the position of the central pedestal. And while this is happening, First Officer Igor somehow miraculously manages to pull out of this dive, but overcorrects, putting the plane into a vertical dive again, and again stalling the plane, causing the plane to enter a spin. And during this particular spin, Kaczynski almost manages to recover the airplane. However, being in a slight panic, he manages to pull the elevator too aggressively to its maximum deflection, which causes the airplane to lose its speed. And while this is happening, to make things even worse than it is right now, somehow during the frantic spate of trying to reshuffle their position, trying to regain control of the positions of this aircraft in the cockpit, someone accidentally presses the rudder input, which causes the plane to enter a second spin. And miraculously, Kaczynski and Igor manages to recover this plane at this second spin. They are able to level off the wings and are able to regain control of the aircraft. Now, a bit reassured that the plane is now in control, Kaczynski turns back to his son and his daughter Eldar and Yana, who is seated right behind him, and reassures them that everything will be okay. And by this time, Eldar and Yana are completely traumatized, as they should be. They survived a 30,000 feet nosedive and somehow miraculously are still breathing. However, their father, being the 40-year-old veteran pilot that he was, they were reassured. However, what they didn't realize is how much they've actually descended during this entire frantic crisis. Their altitude by then was far too low for them to recover. And as Kaczynski was reassuring his children, at 58 minutes past midnight, the plane crashed and killed all occupants immediately.